This is the story of a battleship that earned the name Unsinkable from her own crew, then went to the bottom in 9 days. On the 27th of May, 1941, the German battleship Bismarck sank into the Atlantic with more than 2,000 men aboard, and only around 110 of them ever walked away alive. Here is the detail that unravels the whole legend. The most powerful warship Nazi Germany ever put to sea was not brought down by another battleship. What crippled Bismarck was a fabric-covered biplane, an obsolete ferry swordfish that flew at the speed of a family car, dropping a single torpedo into the one place on the hull that could not survive it. The rudders jammed, the steering died, and a ship that had destroyed the pride of the Royal Navy just 48 hours earlier began steaming in a slow circle, waiting to be killed. That is the paradox at the center of this story, because Bismarck was formidable and Bismarck was doomed, and both of those things were true from the moment she left port. The slogan promised unsinkable. The clock said 9 days. Bismarck was the first of 2 Bismarck-class battleships built for the German Navy, the Kriegsmarine, her sister ship being Tirpitz. The vessel carried the name of Otto von Bismarck, the chancellor who unified Germany in the 19th century, and her construction happened at the Blohm & Voss shipyard in Hamburg, where the keel was laid down on the 1st of July, 1936, under the cover name Ersatz Hanover. Consider what the German Navy was actually building here. On paper, Bismarck was ordered under a nominal limit of 35,000 long tons, the ceiling set by the Washington Naval Treaty System that Germany had signed onto through the Anglo-German Naval Agreement of 1935. On paper, she obeyed that number, and in steel, she did not. Her real weight ran to roughly 41,700 tons standard and around 50,300 tons at full load, and Germany simply concealed the excess. The ship the world was told about and the ship that slid into the water were 2 entirely different ships. That gap between the official story and the real object runs through this entire history, and it returns at the very end, on the seabed, 3 miles down. The strategic idea behind Bismarck was never to win a stand-up fight against the Royal Navy, because Germany could not win that fight, and the German Naval Command understood it perfectly. Their doctrine was commerce raiding, called Kreuzerkrieg, cruiser warfare. Britain lived and died by the Atlantic supply line, the convoys of food and fuel and material crossing from North America, and a fast, heavily armed battleship loose in that ocean could strangle the lifeline. That was the whole theory, to break into open water, sink the merchant ships, and starve the island. The German Navy had good reason to believe the theory worked, because it had just worked. Earlier in 1941, during Operation Berlin, the German Admiral Gunther Lütjens had taken the battleships Scharnhorst and Gneisenau into the Atlantic and sank 22 Allied merchant ships totaling over 115,000 gross register tons. Running from January into March of 1941, that operation ended clean, with the raiders slipping into a French port. The lesson the German command drew was that a surface raider could hunt in the Atlantic and get away with it, and Bismarck became the theory scaled up. Grasped the scale of the weapon before grasping how quickly it died. Bismarck stretched 251 meters long overall, which is over 820 feet, with a beam of 36 meters. Her main armament was 8 15-inch guns, 38-centimeter guns in the German designation, arranged in 4 twin turrets that the German Navy named Anton, Bruno, Caesar, and Dora. Each of those guns hurled a shell weighing around 800 kilograms out to a range of roughly 36 kilometers. Beyond the main battery, the ship bristled with secondary and anti-aircraft weapons, carrying 12 15-centimeter guns as a secondary battery, 16 10.5-centimeter guns, 16 3.7-centimeter weapons, and 12 2-centimeter guns. That sounds formidable, and in one sense it truly was, but notice something about the arrangement, because it matters enormously later. The secondary guns and the anti-aircraft guns were separate systems rather than a single unified dual-purpose battery, and that choice consumed weight while leaving the high-angle anti-aircraft defense weaker than it should have been. Hold that detail, because it becomes the reason a squadron of ancient biplanes could fly into the attack and every one of them survive. The armor matched the guns. Protecting the ship's magazines and engine rooms, the main belt ran 320 millimeters thick, over 12.5 inches of steel, while the turret faces carried 360 millimeters. Builders assembled the hull largely by welding rather than riveting, a modern construction method that saved weight, and they divided it into numerous watertight compartments with a double bottom running most of the length of the ship. On paper, this was a vessel designed to absorb tremendous damage and stay afloat, a ship built to take punishment as well as deliver it. The tragedy, and the lesson, is that staying afloat is not the same thing as staying alive as a fighting ship. Speed rounded out the package, because on trials the ship reached just over 30 knots, driven by 12 boilers and 3 geared turbines producing around 148,000 shaft horsepower. A battleship that could both outshoot most opponents and outrun the rest was exactly the kind of raider the Commerce War Doctrine demanded. Here is a way to understand what the German Navy had actually created, and it comes from a completely different field. In modern engineering, there is a principle that a system optimized for one specialized mission often turns fragile the moment it is pulled outside that mission. A Formula One car is the fastest thing on a race circuit and useless on a gravel road. Bismarck was tuned with total commitment for one job, hunting merchant ships in open ocean, and that specialization is precisely what would betray her. The design assumed she would choose her fights, strike, and run, and it never planned for the day she would be pinned in place and forced to fight the entire home fleet at once. The optimization that made her deadly also made her brittle, because the strength and the flaw were the same single decision. The crew reflected the sheer scale of the machine. A standard complement ran to around 2,065 men, 103 officers and nearly 2,000 enlisted sailors, and during the operation that number climbed past 2,200, because the ship carried fleet staff, prize crews meant to sail captured merchant ships back to port, and war correspondents brought along to record the triumph. Around 600 of the crew had transferred from the lost cruiser Karlsruhe. All of these men stood aboard when Bismarck sailed, and almost none of them would come home. Building her had cost roughly 196.8 million Reichsmarks, an enormous share of the entire German naval budget poured into a single hull, and everything now depended on that one hull performing. On the 5th of May, 1941, Adolf Hitler came aboard to visit Bismarck, and 13 days later the operation began. It carried the name Operation Rheinbahn, Rhine Exercise, and the plan sent Bismarck into the Atlantic paired with the heavy cruiser Prinz Eugen. Grand Admiral Erich Raeder, the head of the Kriegsmarine, had ordered the sortie. Fleet command went to Admiral Gunther Lütjens, the same commander who had succeeded during Operation Berlin, while the captain of Bismarck herself was Ernst Lindemann. The force departed from Gotenhafen, the port now known as Gdynia, with Prinz Eugen slipping out first, around 9 in the evening on the 18th of May, and Bismarck following roughly around 2 in the morning on the 19th. Count from that departure to the sinking on the 27th, and the window is 9 days, which is where the number comes from. Some accounts describe the operation itself as lasting 8 days, counting elapsed time rather than inclusive calendar days, and both figures point at the same brutal fact, that the most powerful ship in the German Navy had barely more than a week of operational life. Before the operation, Admiral Lütjens addressed the assembled crew, and the surviving text of that speech carries a hunter's confidence. Lütjens told the men that the day they had longed for so eagerly had at last arrived, the moment when the proud ship could be led against the enemy, and he closed with the hunter's toast, "Good hunting and a good bag." That was the mood at departure, a hunt, a good bag, and nobody in that formation talked about survival, because survival was simply assumed. The breakout did not stay secret for long. On the 20th of May, the Swedish cruiser Gotland spotted Bismarck and Prinz Eugen in the Kattegat, and word of the sighting reached British intelligence. The next day, British reconnaissance photographed the ships near Bergen on the Norwegian coast. Before Bismarck had fired a single shot in the operation, the Royal Navy already knew a German heavy force was heading for the Atlantic. The hunter had been seen. A modern parallel maps almost exactly onto what happened next, and it comes from the world of digital security. In network defense, there is a concept that the moment your signal is detected, the entire advantage shifts to the defender, who can now concentrate every resource on a known target. Bismarck's whole strategy depended on being a needle in the Atlantic haystack. The instant Gotland logged that sighting and the Bergen photographs came out of the darkroom, Bismarck stopped being a needle and became a target with a heading. Everything the Royal Navy did afterward flowed from the position of a defender who knows exactly what is coming and roughly where. The stealth was the strategy, and the stealth was already gone on day 2. The Royal Navy moved to seal the exits from the North Sea into the open Atlantic. On the 23rd of May, the British cruisers Suffolk and Norfolk made contact with the German force in the Denmark Strait, the passage between Iceland and Greenland, and began shadowing. To intercept, the Royal Navy sent its own icons, the battle cruiser HMS Hood, under Vice Admiral Lancelot Holland, and the new battleship HMS Prince of Wales, under Captain John Leach, both racing to cut the Germans off. HMS Hood was not just any ship. For much of the interwar period, Hood ranked as the largest warship in the world, a symbol of British sea power recognized around the globe. What almost nobody discussed openly was the ship's hidden weakness. Designed in the First World War era, Hood was a battlecruiser, which meant the design had traded deck armor for speed. Against plunging shellfire, the kind that arcs down from long range and strikes the deck rather than the side, but stood dangerously exposed, and the British Admiralty had never fully corrected the flaw. Battle opened early on the 24th of May, 1941. Around 5:52 in the morning the guns began firing, and what followed took only minutes. A salvo from Bismarck struck Hood, a 15-inch shell drove down toward a magazine, and the ammunition stores detonated. HMS Hood, the most famous warship in the Royal Navy, blew apart and vanished beneath the waves in roughly 3 minutes. Sit with the arithmetic of that loss. Of the 1,418 men aboard Hood, 1,415 died, and only 3 survived. Their names were Ted Briggs, William Dundas, and Bob Tilburn, pulled from the freezing water after the greatest single-ship disaster in the history of the Royal Navy. In 3 minutes, Bismarck had killed more men than she herself carried. The shock of that moment is hard to overstate, because the German gunnery had performed with terrifying efficiency. HMS Prince of Wales, the surviving British ship, took damage and broke off, retreating behind a smokescreen. On paper this looked like a total German victory, with the pride of the Royal Navy lying on the bottom of the Denmark Strait while Bismarck steamed on. But the victory carried the seed of the disaster. Before Prince of Wales withdrew, the British battleship had landed 3 hits on Bismarck, and those hits mattered far more than anyone aboard the German ship first understood. One struck the bow area and caused Bismarck to lose fuel and take on water. The ship that had just won the most one-sided battleship duel of the war was now leaking oil, the very fuel needed to complete a long Atlantic raid, trailing it in a visible slick across the sea. Lütjens reached a decision, and the raid was abandoned, with Bismarck breaking off from Prinz Eugen to head for the safety of occupied France, for the port at Brest or Saint-Nazaire, and for repairs. The heavy cruiser Prinz Eugen was detached to continue the mission alone, and that cruiser slipped away, eventually reaching Brest on the 1st of June and surviving the war. Bismarck, the centerpiece, the entire reason for the operation, was now alone, wounded, and running for port with the Royal Navy closing from every direction. Consider the strange fate of Prinz Eugen, because it sharpens the tragedy of Bismarck. The heavy cruiser was the junior partner in the operation, the smaller ship, and the cruiser was the one that lived. Prinz Eugen broke off during the 24th of May while Bismarck drew the pursuit onto herself, continued into the Atlantic, and eventually made the French coast at Brest on the 1st of June, surviving the entire war. The battleship, the pride of the fleet, the reason the operation existed at all, was gone within days. The whole logic of Operation Reinebung had been to pair the 2 ships so the battleship could shield the cruiser and clear the way, and in the end the battleship did exactly that, absorbing the full weight of the Royal Navy while the cruiser escaped, and paying for it with more than 2,000 lives. Before following Bismarck into the hunt, the loss of HMS Hood deserves its own reckoning, because the death of Hood was never simply bad luck. It exposed a weakness the Royal Navy had known about and left unfixed. For much of the period between the 2 world wars, Hood had been the largest warship afloat, and she carried an almost mythic status in Britain. Understand what Hood represented, because for an entire generation she had shown the flag around the globe as the visible symbol of British sea power, the ship that told the world the Royal Navy still ruled the oceans. When people spoke of the might of the British fleet, Hood was the image in their minds. Yet a design flaw sat baked into her from birth. Hood was a battlecruiser, not a battleship, and the distinction is the whole story, because a battlecruiser rested on a bargain, trading away armor to buy speed. Built in the era of the First World War, when that bargain was fashionable, Hood had thin deck armor to keep the ship fast. Against shellfire that came in flat and low, striking the side belt, she was reasonably protected, and against plunging fire, the kind that arcs high and drops steeply onto the deck at long range, she was dangerously exposed. The British Admiralty understood this weakness, and the Admiralty had never fully corrected it. At long range, shells fall onto a ship rather than into her side, and that is exactly the geometry that killed Hood. When the 15-inch shell from Bismarck came down, it never had to defeat the side belt, because it found the thinner deck armor, penetrated toward a magazine, and reached the stored ammunition. What happened next was not damage but annihilation, as the magazine detonated and Hood was torn in half and gone in roughly 3 minutes. Here is what lifts the loss of Hood beyond tragedy and turns it into evidence. 2 separate Royal Navy boards of inquiry investigated the sinking, and both concluded that a shell had penetrated to a magazine and caused the catastrophic explosion. The finding was never guesswork, because it stood as the considered verdict of formal naval investigations. Decades later, when divers surveyed the wreck of Hood in 2001, the evidence on the seabed supported that conclusion. The exact path of ignition can never be fully reconstructed, because the section of the ship where it happened was obliterated in the blast, and alternative theories have persisted, including the possibility of a torpedo detonation or a fire on deck reaching the magazines. Even so, the core finding held across 80 years and 2 examinations. A shell reached the ammunition, and the most famous warship in the Royal Navy died of a weakness her own navy had catalogued and left unrepaired. A hard lesson sits buried in the death of Hood, and it reaches into any field where old assumptions meet new conditions. Hood was built for one era of naval combat and destroyed in another. The deck armor bargain that seemed reasonable when Hood was designed had curdled into a fatal liability by 1941, as gunnery ranges lengthened and plunging fire became the decisive threat. The ship had not changed, but the conditions around her had, and the organization that operated her had recognized the growing danger and failed to act on it in time. Hood did not die because the enemy was invincible. Hood died because a known weakness was allowed to persist until the day it was found. 3 men survived out of 1,418, and those 3, Ted Briggs, William Dundas, and Bob Tilburn, were pulled from the freezing Denmark Strait. Everyone else, 1,415 men, went down with the symbol of British naval power. That is the loss that turned an interception into a national manhunt, and it is why nothing short of Bismarck on the seabed would ever satisfy the Royal Navy. The death of Hood transformed the operation from a naval interception into a national manhunt. Down from the top of the British government came the order that Bismarck had to be destroyed, whatever it cost. Transmitted by the First Sea Lord and later quoted by the official naval historian Stephen Roskill, the genuine documented signal stated that Bismarck must be sunk at all costs, and that if achieving this required the battleship King George V to remain on the scene even to the point of later needing to be towed home, then she must do so. Notice what that order reveals. The Royal Navy was prepared to risk running its own capital ship completely out of fuel and towing it hundreds of miles home, rather than let Bismarck escape. The reputation of the Royal Navy had been wounded in the Denmark Strait, and nothing short of Bismarck on the seabed would answer for Hood. The hunt nearly failed. On the 25th of May, the British lost contact with Bismarck, as the shadowing cruisers slipped off the trail, and for a stretch of hours the most wanted ship in the world had simply vanished into the Atlantic. Bismarck might have made it. And this is where Admiral Lütjens made the mistake that historians still debate, because believing he was still being tracked, Lütjens broke radio silence and sent a long radio transmission. That transmission was exactly what the British needed, since direction-finding stations triangulated the signal, and the very act of speaking gave away the position. It stands as one of the great debated decisions of the naval war, because Lütjens apparently surrendered his location while operating under the false belief that his location was already known. This failure has a modern shape, and it belongs to the world of information itself. In signals theory there is an iron rule, that every transmission is also a beacon. The moment you broadcast, you reveal not just your message but your existence and your position. Modern submarines survive by staying silent, because the instant they transmit, they can be found. Lütjens was running a 1941 battleship on a principle that the submarine services would spend the rest of the century learning to obey in the opposite direction. Convinced he was already exposed, he judged silence pointless, and in fact silence was the only card he still held, and he spent it on a message. Lütjens handed the Royal Navy the signal. The location came from more than direction finding alone. The hunt for Bismarck was won as much in the intelligence war as on the water, and the chain of information that fixed her position is one of the most underappreciated parts of the story. It began before Bismarck ever reached the Atlantic. On the 20th of May, the Swedish cruiser Gotland had logged the German force in the Kattegat, and that sighting worked its way to British intelligence, while British reconnaissance photographed the ships near Bergen on the 21st. From the very start, the British were assembling a picture. Then came the decisive break, and it happened at Bletchley Park, the center of British code-breaking. After Lütjens broke radio silence, the British held a rough fix from direction finding, but they needed confirmation of where Bismarck was heading. That confirmation arrived through an intercepted message, because a senior Luftwaffe officer had a relative aboard Bismarck and made an inquiry about the ship, and the reply, passed through German communications, was decrypted at Bletchley Park. That decrypt confirmed the one fact that mattered, that Bismarck was making for Brest, on the French coast. The British no longer had to guess whether Bismarck was heading north back through the Denmark Strait or south toward France. The codebreakers had answered the question. The last link in the chain was a single aircraft. On the 26th of May, a Catalina flying boat of the Royal Air Force Coastal Command, part of 209 Squadron, resighted Bismarck in the open Atlantic. A detail here escapes most tellings. The Catalina carried an American in the cockpit, a United States Navy ensign flying as co-pilot at a time when the United States was not yet formally at war. The resighting came from a British aircraft with an American at the controls, months before Pearl Harbor. That Catalina found Bismarck a few hundred miles from the safety of Brest, close enough that without the sighting the ship might well have reached air cover and slipped away. The intelligence chain, from the Swedish cruiser to the Bergen photographs to the Bletchley Park decrypt to the Catalina, had kept Bismarck fixed in place long enough for the killing blow to be arranged. The popular legend of Bismarck almost entirely omits this, and it deserves emphasis because it reframes the whole hunt. Bismarck is remembered as a duel of giant ships, a contest of guns and armor, and yet the ship was run to ground by information. She was spotted by a neutral cruiser, photographed by reconnaissance, betrayed by her own radio transmission, confirmed by codebreakers reading German signals, and finally pinned by a patrol aircraft. The guns only finished what the intelligence war had already decided. A debate belongs here, about the man commanding the German force. Admiral Gunther Lütjens made a series of decisions on this operation that historians still argue over. After sinking Hood, Lütjens did not turn and finish the damaged Prince of Wales, a choice later questioned at the highest levels of the German command. Lütjens chose to run for France rather than reverse course back through the Denmark Strait toward home. And Lütjens sent the long radio transmission that gave away his position, apparently convinced he was already being tracked when in fact the British had lost him. Taken together, these choices have painted Lütjens for some historians as fatalistic, a commander who had opposed the timing of the operation and who may have believed from early on that the sortie was doomed. Whether that fatalism shaped his decisions, or whether each choice, held up on its own terms, remains one of the enduring questions of the Bismarck story. The result is not in question. Each decision, in sequence, narrowed the ship's chances until none were left. Even with the position fixed, the British still faced a problem of speed. Bismarck was fast and running for air cover in friendly ports, and the surface ships of the home fleet might not catch her before she reached the protection of the Luftwaffe based in France. Something had to slow her down, and that something came from an aircraft carrier and a squadron of biplanes that looked like they belonged to the previous war. Understand the machine that decided the fate of Bismarck, because the contrast is almost absurd. The ferry Swordfish was a torpedo bomber with an open cockpit and a fabric-covered biplane structure, and crews called it the string bag. Slow, old-fashioned even in 1941, it flew low and lumbering into the teeth of anti-aircraft fire. Against a ship carrying the fire control and the gun batteries of Bismarck, the Swordfish should have flown a suicide mission. The strike came from the aircraft carrier HMS Royal, part of Force H moving up from Gibraltar. The first attack on the evening of the 26th of May nearly ended in catastrophe for the British, because the Swordfish mistakenly attacked HMS Sheffield, a British cruiser shadowing Bismarck. The torpedoes launched at Sheffield malfunctioned, and that accident, a humiliating error, may have saved the entire operation, because it revealed the torpedoes needed adjustment before the real attack. The Swordfish rearmed and launched again into a gale, 15 of these biplanes going after Bismarck in weather that should have grounded them. The anti-aircraft fire came in heavy, and here the design flaws of Bismarck began to tell, because the ship's anti-aircraft defenses could not knock down aircraft this slow and this low. All 15 aircraft returned to Ark Royal, and one had been hit around 150 times and still flew home. 2 or 3 torpedoes struck Bismarck, and most did little damage against that heavy armor belt. One torpedo, though, struck the stern, in the area of the rudders and steering gear, and it jammed the rudders roughly 12 degrees to port. That single hit was the death of the ship. Here is why that one torpedo mattered more than everything else combined. Bismarck ran on 3 propeller shafts, and the ship could not steer effectively on her engines alone once the rudders locked over. A rudder jammed 12 degrees to port meant Bismarck could no longer hold a straight course toward France in safety. The most powerful battleship in the German Navy, her guns intact and her armor belt largely unbreached, was reduced to steaming in a slow, helpless turn. The one part of the ship that could not survive a hit had been hit. That stern was the weakness, and later analysis of German ships of this design would point again and again to a structurally weak stern as a recurring flaw. A single torpedo found the flaw with a single blow. A bitter irony threads through this moment, and it circles back to the ship's own crew. Days earlier, after an air attack had done little more than scratch the paint, Bismarck's sailors had reportedly coined the boast that their ship could not be sunk. The Seaman's report described the earlier torpedo as leaving only scratches on the paintwork. That confidence, born of armor that had genuinely shrugged off an earlier hit, is exactly where the Unsinkable legend came from. It came from the men aboard. And within about 48 hours of that boast, one torpedo in the stern had condemned every one of them. Widely called the single most consequential torpedo of the entire war, the swordfish hit turned a fleeing raider into a floating target. Through the night of the 26th into the 27th, British and Polish destroyers shadowed and harassed the crippled ship, keeping contact, never letting Bismarck slip away again in the dark. Dawn would bring the battleships. The mood aboard. Bismarck had drained away from the hunter's confidence of the departure speech. Admiral Lütjens sent a final signal that survives in the record. The ship, Lütjens reported, was unmaneuverable, they would fight to the last shell, and the message closed with the phrase "Long live the Führer." In the original German, the words ran, Schiff manövrieren or Kämpfen bis zur letzten Granit, es liebt der Führer. A separate message declared that they would fight to the last in their belief in Germany's victory. The tone had changed completely, because the hunt was over, and now it became a matter of how the ship would die. The morning of the 27th of May, 1941, brought the full weight of the Royal Navy down on a ship that could not steer. Admiral John Tovey, the commander-in-chief of the Home Fleet, closed in with the battleships King George V and Rodney, supported by the heavy cruisers Norfolk and Dorsetshire, and around 8:47 in the morning, the British opened fire. What followed was not a duel but a destruction. Bismarck's main guns fell silent within roughly 30 to 45 minutes. Knocked out early, the topside fire control had sat mounted above the armored deck, and once a battleship cannot direct its guns, the guns turn nearly useless no matter how large they are. Bismarck fought back at first, and yet the ship could not maneuver, could not aim effectively for long, and could not escape. The volume of fire was staggering, and it rewards a closer look, because the numbers convey the sheer weight of metal thrown at one ship. Across the final battle, the 4 British ships fired a total of 2,876 shells at Bismarck. Rodney alone fired 380 of her 16-inch shells, the heaviest guns present, along with more than 700 of her secondary 15-centimeter rounds. King George V added over 300 of her 14-inch shells and hundreds more from her secondaries, while the heavy cruiser Norfolk contributed more than 500 8-inch rounds, and Dorsetshire added over 250 of her own. Estimates of the hits landed on Bismarck run into the hundreds, somewhere in the range of 300 to 400 strikes. The German battleship was dismantled from the outside in, her superstructure torn apart, fires spreading through the ship, her guns dropping silent one by one as their crews were killed or their control was severed. Picture what that meant for the men inside. Bismarck was not sinking quickly in these minutes. She was being taken to pieces while still afloat, absorbing hit after hit as the range closed and the British ships poured fire into a target that could not effectively shoot back. The topside fire control that might have let Bismarck aim had gone early. The turrets, Anton and Bruno and Caesar and Dora, fell silent in turn, and still the ship would not go under, her armored belt holding even as everything above it collapsed into burning wreckage. Here is a detail that reframes the entire legend of Bismarck's protection. Of all those hundreds of hits, and the heavy 16-inch shells from Rodney, only 2 of Rodney's shells are assessed to have actually pierced the main armor belt. The belt did its job. The heavy vertical armor largely held, even under a battering that would have been unthinkable in any normal engagement. Bismarck was not destroyed by her armor failing. She was destroyed because she had been immobilized, because her fire control was smashed, and because the Royal Navy could stand off and hammer the superstructure and the unarmored spaces at will. The armor scheme that the German Navy had invested so much displacement in performed exactly as intended. It simply could not save a ship that could no longer steer or aim. The weakness was never the belt. The weakness was the stern, the fire control mounted high in the ship, and a mission that had left her alone against a fleet. By around 10:40 in the morning, it was over, as HMS Dorsetshire moved in and fired torpedoes into the wreck, and Bismarck went down. The exact mechanism of those final minutes would grow into the most argued question of the entire story, and the argument would not be settled for another half-century, until a man in a submersible reached the wreck 3 miles down. Hold that question for a moment, because it is the key to the whole legend. More than 2,000 German sailors died with Bismarck, out of the more than 2,200 aboard. Somewhere around 110 to 116 men were pulled alive from the water, and every account agrees the survivors were a tiny fraction of the crew. The reason so few were saved is one of the most haunting parts of the story, and it turns on a single alarm. HMS Dorsetshire and the destroyer Maori were in the water among the survivors, lines over the side, actively hauling German sailors aboard, when a U-boat alarm went up. A possible periscope was sighted in the water nearby, and the British ships faced an impossible choice. To keep rescuing meant sitting stationary in a patch of ocean where a German submarine might be lining up a shot, risking hundreds of their own men to save enemy sailors. The British broke off the rescue and departed, leaving hundreds of Germans still alive in the Atlantic behind them. The arithmetic of who lived is grim and specific. Dorsetshire pulled somewhere around 82 to 86 men from the sea, and Maori recovered around 25, so those two ships accounted for nearly all the survivors. The following day, a German U-boat and the German weather ship Sachsenwald found only a small handful more, perhaps 5 men between them, clinging to life after a night in the open ocean. Added together and the total who came home was around 110 to 116. Set that against a crew of more than 2,200, and the scale of the loss becomes clear, because for every man saved, roughly 20 were lost. An unknown number of those lost were never killed by shells or by the sinking at all. They survived the battle, survived the plunge of the ship, floated in their life jackets, and were simply left behind when the U-boat alarm sent the rescuers away. They died waiting for a rescue that had already turned and gone. The senior surviving officer was Baron Burkhard von Mullenheim-Rechberg, who had commanded the aft gunnery control, and decades later he wrote the definitive survivor's account, the memoir Battleship Bismarck, a survivor's story. In it he described the moment he was hauled up the side of Dorsetshire, keeping both hands on the line, asking to be brought aboard, then standing on the deck as a prisoner of war in an oil-stained uniform. The first thing he did was look back over the side at his comrades still in the water, and he described hundreds of them, hundreds of yellow life jackets, perhaps 800 men by his estimate, still alive in the sea as the ship pulled away. Set that image against the departure speech. 9 days earlier, Admiral Lütjens had offered the crew the hunter's toast, good hunting, and a good bag, and now the senior survivor counted yellow life jackets from the deck of a British cruiser as it steamed away from the men it could not save. That is the arc of Operation Regenbogen compressed into 2 images, the toast and the life jackets. Now to the question held back from the final battle, because this is where the legend is truly tested. The question is who really sank the Bismarck. For decades the story split into 2 versions. The British and popular account ran straightforward, that the Royal Navy hunted Bismarck down and sank her with gunfire and torpedoes, avenging Hood. The German survivors told a different story. Men who had been aboard, including survivors from the engine and machinery spaces, testified that as the end came, scuttling charges were set below and the sea valves opened deliberately, to send the ship down by the crew's own hand and deny the Royal Navy the final blow. In their account, Bismarck was scuttled, and the Germans sank the Bismarck, not the British. This was never a small dispute, because it went to the heart of the legend. The question was whether the mightiest ship in the Royal Navy's most wanted hunt had actually been sunk by British guns, or whether she had proven so unkillable that only her own crew could finish her. The answer came from the bottom of the Atlantic. On the 8th of June, 1989, the ocean explorer Robert Ballard, the same man who had found the Titanic, located the wreck of Bismarck. She lay some 470 miles west of Brest, at a depth of 4,790 meters, over 15,000 feet down, and what Ballard found changed the argument. Bismarck sat upright on the seabed, her hull remarkably intact. Unlike the Titanic, whose stern had imploded and shattered as it sank, Bismarck showed no catastrophic implosion of the hull, which fit a ship that had already flooded and settled rather than one torn apart by the sea pressure of a violent, structurally failing descent. The wreck was, in fact, far better preserved than the Titanic, with sections of teak deck and paint still identifiable. The forensic reading of the wreck came from naval architects William Garsk and Robert Doolan, who served as technical advisors on the analysis, and their conclusion favored neither side cleanly. It resolved the debate into a single, more honest answer. British gunfire and torpedoes, they concluded, had already left Bismarck a defeated and sinking ship, with the battle having doomed her beyond recovery. The scuttling charges set by the crew, in their assessment, merely accelerated an end that was already inevitable. In their words, the scuttling charges merely accelerated her inevitable demise. So both stories were true, and both were incomplete. The Royal Navy had beaten Bismarck, and the battle had made her sinking certain, and the crew, seeing that the ship was finished, opened the valves and hastened the descent. The British had sunk her as surely as if no charges had been set, and the Germans had delivered the last blow to a ship already dying. The forensic evidence 3 miles down turned an argument into a sequence, first the guns, then the certainty of sinking, then the charges. The wreck settled it. The scuttling debate is only the first myth the wreck and the record force us to reconsider. The larger question is about the ship herself. The legend calls her the invincible super battleship, and the record asks whether she was instead an overrated machine that revealed serious flaws the moment she was tested. The case that Bismarck was over-mythologized is strong, and it rests on specific engineering. Her armor scheme descended from First World War thinking, an older incremental layout rather than the more weight-efficient all-or-nothing scheme adopted in contemporary American and British designs. That older approach meant Bismarck spent an enormous amount of displacement on armor that protected her less efficiently than the same tonnage might have on a newer scheme. She carried a great deal of armor-grade steel, and the protection it bought was not proportional to the weight. Consider the fire control next. Bismarck's main fire control position sat above the armored deck, high in the ship, and went out early in the final battle. Contemporary designs increasingly placed fire control below the armored deck for exactly this reason. Once your ability to aim the guns is mounted where a single hit can destroy it, the size of the gun stops mattering very quickly. And then there is the stern. That structurally weak stern was a recurring flaw across German ships of this design lineage, and it was precisely the stern that failed Bismarck when the swordfish torpedo struck the rudder area. The single most important hit of the battle landed on the single most vulnerable major structure of the ship. That is not entirely bad luck. That is a flaw waiting to be found. The anti-aircraft weakness belongs on the same list, because Bismarck carried separate secondary and anti-aircraft batteries rather than a unified dual-purpose scheme, which wasted displacement and left the high-angle anti-aircraft defense weaker than it should have been. That weakness is the direct reason 15 slow biplanes could fly into the attack and every one of them survive. A ship with stronger high-angle defense might have knocked down the swordfish that doomed her. The case, though, does not run one way, and honesty requires the counter-argument. Defenders of the design point out that Bismarck incorporated a great deal of armor-grade steel, that her close-range protection was excellent, and that her short-range gunnery and optics were genuinely superb. Remember the Denmark Strait, where Bismarck destroyed HMS Hood with devastating, efficient gunnery in a matter of minutes. That was not luck but a superbly built fighting machine doing exactly what it was designed to do. Remember the final battle too, because under a battering of hundreds of hits, the main armor belt largely held, with only 2 of Rodney's 16-inch shells assessed to have pierced it. A ship that can absorb that punishment and keep her belt intact was not a fragile ship. So the honest verdict lands in the middle, and it is more interesting than either legend. Bismarck was a formidable, well-built, superbly gunned battleship, and she was built around an obsolete concept with specific structural flaws that a determined enemy could exploit. She was both. The ship that sank Hood in 3 minutes and the ship that was crippled by a biplane and pinned for slaughter were the same ship. The excellence and the obsolescence lived in the same hull. One more myth remains to challenge, and it is the largest of all. The legend treats Bismarck as a near miss, a mighty weapon that almost succeeded and was brought down by bad luck and a golden torpedo. The strategic record suggests something much harder, that the entire operation was a reckless bet, likely to fail from the start. Consider the position. Germany sent a single battleship into an ocean dominated by the Royal Navy, and the other heavy ships that might have supported her were unavailable. Bismarck went out nearly alone, with only a heavy cruiser that was detached early. The best possible outcome of the whole gamble was mercantile attrition, sinking some merchant ships, while the risk was the loss of an irreplaceable capital ship that had consumed a vast share of the naval budget. The moment the other ships dropped out and Bismarck was operating alone, the operation had already narrowed to a single vulnerable hull against the entire home fleet. A deeper irony sits in how the operation was conceived. The German command sent Bismarck out precisely because commerce raiding had just worked. During Operation Berlin, in the early months of 1941, Admiral Lütjens had taken Scharnhorst and Gneisenau into the Atlantic and sank 22 Allied merchant ships totaling over 115,000 gross register tons, then brought both ships safely into a French port. That success is exactly what made Reinebung seem reasonable, because the command reasoned from a win and assumed the next raid would follow the pattern. The conditions, though, had changed. The Royal Navy stood alert, the intelligence net had tightened, and this time the raiding force was a single battleship rather than a pair of ships that could support each other. Reasoning from the last success into a changed situation is one of the oldest ways that competent organizations walk into disaster. The consequences of the loss confirm how bad the bet was. After Bismarck went down, the German surface raiding strategy effectively ended, and the great gamble of sending capital ships into the Atlantic to strangle Britain's supply lines was over. The loss struck at the top of the German state, with reports describing the German leadership as dejected and irritable after the sinking, and thereafter major operations by the surface fleet were restricted. Nazi Germany had risked its most powerful surface ship on a single operation, lost her in 9 days, and then pulled back from the entire doctrine that ship had been built to serve. The commerce rating theory that had looked so promising after Operation Berlin died in the Atlantic with Bismarck's crew. Her sister ship, Tirpitz, would spend much of her career lurking in Norwegian fjords as a threat in being rather than a raider, tying down British resources by merely existing, until she too was destroyed. The age of the surface raider was effectively finished the moment Bismarck went under. This is where the story connects to something far beyond naval history, a lesson that reaches into modern strategy of every kind. There is a principle in high-stakes decision-making that concentrating your entire capability into a single irreplaceable asset, then committing that asset to a mission where discovery means destruction, is one of the most fragile bets you can make. The value is enormous, and the single point of failure is total. Bismarck was that bet: one hull, one operation, discovered on day 2, crippled by day 8, gone by day 9. The German Navy had built a magnificent single point of failure, and then found out, in 9 days, exactly how it failed. The legend of Bismarck comes wrapped in phrases and images that most people take as fact, and nearly all of them are more complicated than they seem, while some are simply false. Pulling them apart is not pedantry. It is the difference between the story that was manufactured and the story that happened. Start with the most famous phrase of all, the command to sink the Bismarck. Repeated so many times that it feels like a direct order shouted by the British leadership, it was nothing of the kind. No documented order reads, in those clean 3 words, sink the Bismarck. That phrasing is a popularization, and its true origin is not a war room at all, because it comes from a 1960 film and a hit song of the same year. What did exist was a genuine signal, transmitted by the First Sea Lord and preserved by the official naval historian Stephen Rosekill, stating that Bismarck must be sunk at all costs, and that if sinking her required the battleship King George V to stay on the scene until she had to be towed home, then she must do so. That is the real order, and it reveals far more than the catchphrase, because it shows a navy willing to risk towing its own battleship hundreds of miles home rather than let Bismarck live. The slogan is fiction. The desperation behind it was real. Then there is the cat. One of the most charming stories attached to Bismarck is the tale of a ship's cat that survived the sinking, was rescued, and went on to survive 2 more sinkings aboard British ships, earning the name Unsinkable Sam. It is a wonderful story, and it is also almost certainly a legend. No survivor record places a cat aboard Bismarck. The detailed accounts of the sinking never mention it. Even the maritime institutions that hold artwork associated with the legend acknowledge the serious doubts about whether the animal ever existed as the story claims. The cat is folklore, a comforting fiction stitched onto a catastrophe that killed 2,000 men, and it survives because people would rather remember a lucky cat than hundreds of yellow life jackets left in the Atlantic. Consider one more piece of the legend, the boast of unsinkability itself. This one is not an outside invention, because it came from the crew. After an earlier air attack did little more than mark the paintwork, with the seaman's report describing the damage as scratches on the paintwork, the men aboard Bismarck reportedly began saying their ship could not be sunk. The confidence made sense, because they had watched their armor shrug off a torpedo. Yet the word unsinkable was born aboard the ship, from the crew's own faith in the steel around them, and it was disproven within days by a single torpedo striking the one place that faith did not cover. The most enduring label attached to Bismarck was coined by men who would drown believing it. The pattern in all 3 myths runs the same: the clean order, the lucky cat, the unsinkable ship. Each is a simplification that survived because it made a better story than the truth, and each dissolves the moment it meets the record. That is the danger of a legend built for repetition, because it smooths away exactly the details that matter most. Popular culture actively shaped the legend after the war. The story of Bismarck reached its enormous fame not only through history but through a 1960 British film dramatizing the pursuit, and through a hit song released the same year that carried the tale to American audiences and climbed high on the music charts. Those 2 works, the film and the song, are the true source of the "Sink the Bismarck" catchphrase that so many people believe was a literal wartime order. The popular memory of Bismarck, in other words, was written partly by scriptwriters and songwriters, not only by sailors and historians. The ship became a legend, and then the legend became entertainment, and the entertainment rewrote what people thought they knew about the ship. Bismarck lies today where Robert Ballard found her in 1989, 4,790 meters down on the flank of an extinct undersea mountain, some 470 miles west of Brest. The hull is buried in sediment to about the level of the original waterline, and the four great main turrets, Anton, Bruno, Caesar, and Dora, fell out of the ship as she capsized and lie scattered across the debris field. The wreck stands remarkably preserved, better than the Titanic, with teak decking and traces of paint still visible where the sea has not stripped them. Ballard chose not to salvage artifacts, treating the site as what it is, a war grave, the resting place of more than 2,000 men, and under maritime law the property of Germany. The wreck was revisited in the years that followed, including an expedition in 2001 that carried survivors back to the site, and a separate survey that located specific battle damage, and yet the ship has been left as a grave, undisturbed. Return now to the paradox from the opening. The crew called Bismarck Unsinkable, and the word came from them, from the confidence of men who had watched their armor shrug off an early torpedo as scratches on the paintwork. The record shows what that word was worth. 9 days from the departure at Gotenhafen to the final plunge west of Brest. One biplane torpedo in the stern to cripple her. 2,000 men dead. Around 110 survivors. A main armor belt that largely held to the very end, protecting a ship that could no longer steer, aim, or run. The name Unsinkable proved true in the narrowest possible sense and false in the only sense that mattered. The belt was never really beaten. The ship was. Bismarck fell not to a single stronger opponent but to a system, to the reconnaissance that spotted her, the signals intelligence and direction finding that fixed her, the cheap carrier aircraft that crippled her, and the battleships that finished the work. She was overwhelmed by combined arms, by many kinds of force working together against a single hull optimized for a different fight entirely. That is the real meaning of Bismarck's 9 days. She marked a turning point in the age of the battleship itself, because a lone super battleship, however powerful, could be found by intelligence, tracked by signals, crippled by aircraft that cost a fraction of her price, and pounded to the bottom by a fleet. The future of naval war lay in the aircraft carrier that launched those swordfish and in the codebreakers and reconnaissance flights that fixed her position, not in the giant guns of the ship they hunted. Bismarck was one of the mightiest battleships ever built, and her destruction helped prove that the mightiest battleship ever built was no longer enough. The German Navy built Bismarck to be the ship the world could not tell the truth about, a hull that displaced far more than the treaties allowed, hidden behind an official number. In the end the sea told the truth the paperwork concealed. The ship that was too large to admit to and too powerful to fear was found in 9 days, crippled in one blow to her weakest point, and sunk with almost her entire crew, while her supposedly invincible armor belt held firm over a corpse of a ship. Everything about Bismarck was a version of that same gap between the story and the object. The unsinkable slogan and the 9-day life. The magnificent gunnery and the obsolete concept. The armor that held and the stern that failed. The hunter's toast at departure and the yellow life jackets left in the water. The legend and the wreck. She rests now 3 miles down, upright, nearly whole, her turrets scattered around her, one of the most powerful warships ever built and one of the shortest lived. The question her story leaves behind is the one worth carrying away from the seabed. When a nation pours everything it has into a single magnificent weapon and calls it unsinkable, the honest reckoning is whether it has built its greatest strength, or its greatest and most certain point of failure.